I'm Michael Pollett, and I'm an economist at the Judge Business School, and we've got all the speakers from this afternoon back up here. I can't resist some comments about markets, as you might imagine, an economist. I love the comment about inventing the future, and of course, economists can invent the future as well. So if you set something up as a decentralized, deregulated, small-scale, competitive market, it might stay that way. If you set it up as a big monopoly, it might also stay that way as it continues into the future. So yeah, we're a big fan of inventing the future in terms of economic redesign as well as engineering design. The other thing which, of course, an economist might always want to point out is, let's be very careful not to suffer from money illusion. Okay, so big numbers like 20 billion or 100 billion or 200 billion, or of course they're not big numbers now for economists or for everybody else in the light of the financial crisis. As we know, we can create 250 billion at the keystroke of a pen in the Bank of England now. So we don't need to worry about numbers, but we do need to just be careful when we hear big numbers being bandied around that they're put in context. And I think Steve did a good job trying to do that. 200 billion is not a big sum of money in terms of aggregate UK investment going out to 2020. And of course, we also need to not put up, and I think Chris did a really nice job of correcting himself, I felt, of putting up figures where we show the decline in UK capacity over the next 10 years or 20 years if we don't do anything. And as I've often said, of course, I could have put the same diagram up about top Cambridge professors, half of whom are due to retire in the next 15 years. Is Cambridge University doomed? Well, I hope not, because, of course, hopefully we're replacing some of them as we go along. Or hospitals, or whatever you pick, it's true that half of the capacity is due to decline in the next 20 years. The question is whether we're going to efficiently replace it rather than expensively replace it. And Sean, of course, has beautifully prompted me by throwing down the cudgel at economists. And of course, economists love something like the Central Electricity Generating Board, because it was a great centrally planned Soviet-style monopoly, and it did what Soviet monopolies do quite well, which is it does plan things until, of course, the system becomes so complex that it can't handle planning anymore. And of course, what we're often talking about in market economies is the optimal degree of planning. There's a great discussion in one of the key papers about the theory of the firm by Ronald Coase, who won a Nobel Prize for it, where he says that the private capitalist firm in a deregulated market is brilliant because it results in the optimal degree of planning. So it essentially leave the degree of planning in the system to be determined as the outcome of competition. And within a company you have planning, but in the market you don't have planning. And so what we're often talking about when we have these debates is not the plan versus the market, but the optimal degree of planning. So perhaps that sort of stimulates some opening discussion to our panelists. Please. Chris.
It's a question to Chris. We've seen the off-gem scenarios as we go to, say, 2015, 2016 period with low capacity margins, and you said you on behalf of Grid, have a nervousness as capacity margins shrink. Now we have an energy market that we've talked about that's supposed to balance supply and demand, and in addition to that, you have the monopsony, ancillary service and reserve market. So in that context, how tempted are you as Grid to procure very large amounts of capacity, very high utilization rate, in your variety of operating reserve and other ancillary service contracts?
I think we'll always feel an obligation to make sure that we've got sufficient reserve such that whatever the generation mix going forward, we've got a high degree of confidence that we can maintain security of supply. we do have 99.99996% off grid and actually 100% off the gas grid. And it actually is something that we take very seriously indeed. We've only had sort of one major loss in the last 7 years, and it still hurts. It really does hurt. So, by the same token, I think we have to make sure that we don't actually go out and start to distort things by saying, well, we're going to procure more and more and more and more because we are nervous. And we have to be, I guess, are we conservative? Are we nervous? I think we sort of have to be using one of Michael's comments rather. We have to be sort of optimally nervous, if you like. I think we will be held responsible if we don't do the right things in terms of balancing the system. But by the same token, it is actually the market that has been providing all the tools that have enabled us to actually balance the system and keep the lights on to date. And I think our role should be the residual role. We are incentivized around that residual balancing mechanism anyway. I think we will, and Steve might comment on this, we expect to be continue to be incentivized into the future, but we mustn't sort of get into command and control mode. I think the markets, speaking as an economist, this is really rare for me to be amongst so many economists. I think the markets work pretty well actually for the last number of decades. It's brought forward that generation that Steve talked about earlier. It has absolutely kept the lights on. My real worry going forward about a world in which we say, markets have done a great job, but looking forward, they might not necessarily be able to provide security of supply in all the scenarios that we see, is actually how do you start to take interventionist actions without actually spooking the rest of the market and distorting the investment signal. So I think we will try and get that optimal nervousness in place so that we can take sufficient actions to keep the lights on without actually going over the top and just procuring everything that might possibly be coming our way.
Yeah, I think, just to be clear what I was saying in terms of discovery, the missing market at the moment, which is preventing the private sector and the market doing what it's done consistently over the last 20 years, is carbon. So, if we took that problem away, Michael's point's absolutely right. If you went back, I can remember back in sort of 2004-5, people starting to worry about 2010-11 and saying, we've got these new arrangements, we don't have capacity payments, will things be built? Well, yes, they were built, and they were CCGTs, and it's quite nervous for Chris as system operator, because given a 3-year lead time, he's there looking at 2011 in 2005, nothing's happening, 2006, and then suddenly it comes forth and it gets built. The problem at the moment is if you're sat in a boardroom saying, right, it's obvious that, if I have this view on carbon prices, I build a gas-fired plant. If I have that view on carbon prices, I have a go at nuclear, I have a go at CCS, I try a different technology. But that market is entirely political and is one that involves you taking a very big punt on the coalition government, on the EU, and potentially even on the US administration, etc., etc. So I think that's that. Nobody is suggesting that markets can't solve these problems and solve them very well, but we have this big problem at the moment that your view on carbon price will have a huge impact on what you choose to build, and that may be the thing, combined with skittish financial markets where in an era where there isn't as much money flowing around and boards feel under more pressure, that you just get people sit back and say, actually let's just wait, and we might trip beyond that point where it's too late. So and that's why I gave those slides at the outset about the press. We absolutely weren't saying markets aren't working. We're saying the problem is that we have this big uncertainty, and we are sympathetic to companies that say with that uncertainty it's difficult for us to know what to do. And it's not a market risk, which companies are good at managing. It's an acutely political risk, and as I say, it's difficult for investors to take a punt on that. Not impossible, but difficult, and that's the worry. So I endorse everything Michael said about and Chris has said about the way markets work. We just need to realise we're in a particularly special point in time, and Britain has the problem that perhaps other European countries don't, because for all the reasons that Chris and I described, we've just got this big slough off of plant that means that it's a real pinch point, that if you go and Germany needs to replace plant, but not as much, because they invested and most of their plants LCPD compliant already, and their nuclear plants have longer lives than us. So
When when you say that there's a bigger risk associated with, say, nuclear, for instance, are you really saying that the nuclear lobbyists are somehow less effective than the oil and carbon lobbyists?
No, I mean, it's a straight economic proposition, which is, you know, I mean, I've seen presentations from David and other colleagues. You know, if you look at as an investment proposition, you know, even if you take a fairly or optimistic view of the capital costs of nuclear, then in the absence of a robust carbon price, a gas-fired power plant has a lower all-in cost. And so, it's not a comment about lobbying. It's just a question of fact. You know, absent any lobbying, you know, if I was sat there in a boardroom trying to do the economic appraisal, then that would be the thing that I'd keep coming back to, saying, whether the right thing for me to do is to build a CCGT or build nuclear. Fundamentally hinges, it's not really driven by views on the gas price. It's carbon that's the real influencer.
I think one issue which is worth adding is there's a political uncertainty about which you are talking about. But the next thing is regulatory uncertainty. And it's because after the Discovery project was published, we don't know what will happen with the markets, whether they will have or not. And it's worth remembering that one of the reasons there was an energy crisis in California in the year 2000 was they were busy designing new market structure for California for a number of years, and no one was investing in generation capacity. And then finally, there was a shortage of power, and that's the reason why we have Arnold Schwarzenegger as a governor of California, because people were fed up with power shortages in the richest state in the United States. So I think there's a risk which is worth considering.
And just as a follow-up, I mean, I also believe in markets. I mean, I said that in my talk. I think that what I was arguing against was actually 10% of the market. And I believe that markets often lead to very good equilibrium with like gluten-free flour on the shelves. But there's an issue of timescales. I mean, how long does it take to go from one equilibrium to another? And that's why it makes a lot of sense for, even if it's misguided as it is in the U.S. I mean, having a 30% renewable in New York in 5 years is misguided, but it's giving the system a shove. And maybe it's not quite in the right direction, but perhaps we'll get to an equilibrium there that will be better. And we'll have a market, and there'll be controls on it. But and it's a question. How can the transients in economic systems are at least as important as equilibrium.
Annie, do you want to follow?
I think this will be rather short because two of the speakers, more or less, I was going to ask about governance and regulation. The real suggestion is that without long-term commitment at the government level, we'll have this problem that you identified very clearly. And so if we're scientists and engineers, rather than futzing around with models, what can we do to actually make that point? So I'm going to suggest it's not about, we've been talking about lots of technical issues here, but I keep hearing this view repeated over and over again, whether it's by RWE or GDF Suez or you. It's the other uncertainties, and it's about credible commitment. So I'm going to suggest that all the rest is spitting in the wind, just to be controversial, forget about it. How do we as a scientific community make that point?
So I think everybody can respond to that. How can modelling help in conditions of uncertainty? Who wants to go first?
Well, I mean,
Sure.
First of all, if we want to understand the competitive equilibrium outcome, we need to understand the social planner's problem first. We need to understand how much reserves we need to deal with N-1.
How do we make the point to the social
Yeah,
planner
that's
that if they
right.
don't commit, we can't get the solution that they're asking industry and the market to
That's a
provide?
question. But
That's my question.
I should put that to somebody else because I just don't believe the market can necessarily do it. I think.
I'm not even arguing for that. I'm saying we need commitment in regulation and governance. Isn't about necessarily
let me try then, because it's just the thing is that we definitely want a reliable, predictable system. Okay, and so it seems that there are lots of ways to have greater certainty of what the actions of the generators will be the next day. For example, not letting them change their mind. There's a unit commitment problem, and right now they get paid the marginal price if they decide to sell to Norway instead of in. Well, that creates more uncertainty, and uncertainty is the problem. We want to have much more certain behavior. So if we limited the range of behaviors of the generators, that's one example, then we have a more predictable system, and then our models would be more tractable, and we'd have a better, a lower variance of the outcome and lower variance of prices.
Can I say, I mean, I understand Danny's question to be how do scientists and engineers, whatever, influence the policymakers to understand this?
That's my question.
So
Can
how do we, I just try and sharpen.
Well, I'll try and have a crack at that. We do have the advantage that it doesn't matter what political hue you are of, and it doesn't matter who got elected last time round, actually the UK is bound by European legislation in terms of the emissions targets that we're working towards. So actually there's very little difference between all the major parties in terms of some of the challenges that lay ahead and what we've got to do. We who operate in the energy industry are sort of nervous rather, that things aren't happening fast enough in order to make that journey. I talked about the issues around planning, for example, earlier on, and I know there's colleagues from other energy companies in the business who I know would share those worries. But of course, when we go and talk to government about, well, unless you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and you do this, we won't get there in time, that is usually something that would be actually promoting investments that we would want to make. So we sort of would say that, wouldn't we? And of course, the answer to that is yes, we would, but it doesn't make it the wrong answer. Now, if we have got academics and engineers and others actually saying, well, from the studies that we've done, then actually unless action is taken in some of these arenas, and absolutely settling on the price of carbon that incentivises the industry would be a great example, then actually the more weight of academic thinking and persuasion towards government actually might help to push the policies forward. Interestingly, of course, the coalition government have now said that they want to move to an even more ambitious target than 20% of renewables by 2020. In order for that to happen, then we're going to have to really start to see things happening in terms of the policy arena.
I think you can bring Yanis's point together to do that. I mean, going back to, we've had 3 white papers on energy under the previous administration within the last 7 or 8 years. We've got another one coming. We've got our 4th energy bill within 10 years. You know, there are simple solutions out there. I mean, the basic problem the politicians face is, you know, they have this commitment, which is all good and very grand, but, you know, they don't want to hammer the UK economy if nobody else is going to do it. And, you know, we all saw what happened in Kyoto, post-Kyoto, in you know, the attempts in Copenhagen to renegotiate that. And that is the problem. So basically, there are simple solutions that we've been proposing in 2 previous papers where you don't have to throw the market out. You know, you can leave that in place, but you can say, look, you know, if you want to at least be on a path where this is credible, there are some simple interventions you can make which will get some of this stuff built and mean that, you know, you can build on it in the future. You know, those are some of the options we presented in Discovery. Now, I am the answer. You know, we need to be careful. You know, if we tip the whole thing up, then people won't invest. So we need, you know, we need the regulator saying that, we need the scientific community, we need to try and coalesce around something we can all agree that will do that, and they need to be getting consistent response from everyone to say, look, this works, you know, in the world you live in, this is okay. And I think at the moment, and it comes back to the point about the political lobbying, you know, the energy industry, you know, you get rent-seeking behaviour and people chasing their own technology. We just need everyone to try and come together, and or maybe the scientists and the engineering community, the regulators, the economists, to say, okay, well, forget all that, that's just lobbying. Here's something that works, that will give you what you want. And I think if they're getting that consistent message, then who knows, maybe they might listen and maybe they might put some legislation in to do that.
And I think, sorry, just one other point, I think part of the dilemma for them is again, the point that Steve brought out in his remarks about actually the whole affordability of the solutions going forward. Because irrespective of what solutions we come up with, you know, it is going to be more expensive, and, you know, fuel poverty is an issue today, and it's going to be an even bigger issue going into the future.
In terms of modeling, you know, how we can help, so going back to Michael's question, how we can help with modeling the policymakers. Well, I think we should provide them with real information. I mean, it's worth remembering. Now, we are talking about those ambitious energy targets, but if you remember, the energy targets 10 years ago was 10% of renewable energy by 2010 and 20% electricity, sorry, electricity, and 20% by 2020, and we've missed it. I mean, at the moment it's about 4%. I think we are 2010, 4 or 5%. So we are half of the target, and we have even more ambitious targets. So the question is, what is really practically available? We are a small island, first of all. There's no much place to put renewable plants or others. So what is practical advice in terms of what is physically real, what can be built in the time scale available? I mean, for example, David McKay's book, the Without Hot Air, is an attempt. What can we do? Communicated in simple language with policymakers. What doing back of the envelope calculations so people can understand what is really practical and what can be done. So I think we need more policy advice like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to say that one is you shouldn't oversell modelling in the sense of you shouldn't, if you're not, most models are not capable of modelling all the political complexity and all the distributional issues in marginal constituencies that affect actual policy. But what they can do is precisely what Steve has said, which is they can come up with, if you wanted to do things at least cost, here are the basic policies that you put in place, like a universal carbon price. And compare that, well, what if you don't do that and you just subsidize individual technologies? Models can answer those sort of questions very well and give you orders of magnitude of difference in costs, for instance, rather than answer the whole, how does the politician make the decision? Because that is a political decision.
One more thing about risk and uncertainty. Maybe it's a simple question. I'm not sure if the answer's already known. What is the cost of not achieving the 2020 targets?
Steve, you ought to know the answer to this. What's the cost to consumers of not achieving these targets? Or the UK PLC?
It just comes back to, you can bring in the sterner view to that. You have to have a view on what the damage of not meeting carbon is, but then at the end of the day, the UK is 2% of global carbon emissions. So, as I said, answers on a postcard, please. I don't know how to respond to it other than say, you can grind those numbers out. We know what the economic costs might be in terms of the direct costs of making the investments to do that. What the costs are if we don't make it in terms of the cost of those carbon emissions is very, very difficult because it then hinges on what everyone else is doing. But as I said, I think what I said is that there is just a great unreality, I think, amongst all the political parties, and they are all equally guilty about not being upfront with customers about what this is really going to cost. And there's been much discussion, there was a couple of jibes about Enron. The way we do this policy in the UK at the moment is Enron-esque, or even probably to get a more up-to-date example is CDO-esque in terms of hiding things off balance sheet because we have a customer's bill. We're just pouring more and more into that in a completely untransparent way. And it's only at some point people are going to realise, well, actually this isn't going up because of suppliers' margins, it's going up because of this. We did some deliberative stuff where we went out and took panels of consumers in various parts around the country and started telling them what proportion of their bill was being spent on things that the government introduced and what they were doing. And there was real anger, and not anger that it was being spent, anger that they didn't know. And so you had people who were out there buying green tariffs because they didn't actually know that £20 of their existing electricity bill was already going there. So I think the other thing we could do is just get much more transparency into that so that the electorate can see what's being spent at the moment and whether that is delivering value for money, because, for example, on renewables, we pay an awful lot of money for not very much. We can all work out that means it must be going somewhere. And I think if you did that, then we'd have a more grown-up political debate. I don't think it was helped by the fact we have an election coming, and therefore it wasn't in anyone's interest to tell tough messages. Hopefully now with the coalition government that at least says it expects to be in power for at least 5 years, then it might have to think about this a bit more carefully, because it might actually be around with some of the consequences of its decisions.
Risk, cost of not achieving targets?
Well, I think there's another way of looking at it. It's a very simplistic way, and it's the size of the fine that gets imposed by the EU because we missed the emissions target. And for me, the worry is, we're behind the curve at the moment. We need a number of things to happen. We've talked about what they might be already in order to help us move towards the 2020 emissions reduction. And we've certainly looked at scenarios where actually with offshore wind being developed and other renewables, we do actually hit those targets. I think where I have a worry is if we start to get behind the curve and we see other European community countries also getting behind the curve, might we see some collective move away from those European targets, with countries saying, actually, in hindsight, we found that they are sort of overly ambitious and we're going to push them back a little bit. Now, I don't see the UK government doing that unilaterally, but it might be that if other European countries start to get behind the curve, we might see that happening. And then you're back into the issue of, well, if that happens, we're not tackling the issue of emissions globally, or at least playing our part in that, and that's certainly something I wouldn't want to see.
I mean, I think it's worth highlighting, isn't it, that the carbon target and the renewables target are very different. They're materially different in the sense that there is definitely a fine from missing the carbon target. It's not at all clear what the incentive to hit the renewables target is, because the last one was changed before the date arrived, so it was never actually enforced. And it's also the case that people are much more comfortable with the renewables target. Governments are much more comfortable with it because it's just a straightforward industrial policy. Whereas the carbon target, as Steve has pointed out, is what are we actually getting for our money in hitting the carbon target? And are we actually reducing world carbon? I mean, that's not at all clear given leakage.
Can I just bring in one other point? There's a thing here for me around societal expectations as well. And the example I would use is that a few months ago we had the announcement on the proposed nuclear sites. That announcement would have been greeted a very different way 5, 6 years ago than it was greeted on the day. I mean, very little reaction in terms of the public saying, absolutely not, we're all scared of this, we don't want nuclear stations. Why? Because actually our society has been educated to the need to decarbonise in order to protect our planet going forward. And if we start coming off that curve in terms of the journey towards it, then actually societal expectations might start to change again. So I think there is a real danger that unless some of these things fall into place, we actually have to start doing even more work than we've done already to make sure that actually society, economics and policies are all joined up.
And just a comment to follow that I think that the situation was even more so, wasn't it, in Finland? There was a huge public dialogue there before Finland actually decided to build its nuclear plant. I mean, I don't know whether, I want to ask a question, I don't know whether it makes sense or not, because I don't know enough about the game, but it's a more mathematical thing. We've been talking about the market operating and the hard decisions you have to make about future plant, very long time scales. Are there issues in terms of the market operating, as it were, the supply and demand market operating minute by minute, hour by hour? And in particular, because the kind of operations that you have to achieve anything like a sort of market equilibrium vary so much, and this was made by Sean, vary so much. I don't know whether there is actually a mathematical framework for understanding the kind of multiple timescales that you have in supply and demand markets on a sort of daily basis. The extreme examples are, I mean, I know about the business of deciding the market for allocation of 3G resources, and that was an auction, which took place over quite a long time. And I know about, I'm exposed a little bit on futures trading, which takes place on a computer on millisecond timescales. Mm-hmm. Now, there's all kinds of timescales issues in your game. Is that a mathematical, something that you study from a mathematical point of view, or is it actually just too nerdy and complex?
Anders, do you want to go first on that?
Well, there's a lot of literature about consecutive markets, and I think, again, one of the reasons California collapsed was the sequence of markets was wrongly designed. There was arbitrage opportunities between them. So, the problem is there's a lot of math going into it, and again, there are some solutions around the world. In the United States, some of the markets co-optimize energy power dispatch with reserve, some don't. So I think it is a quite nice mathematical problem, actually, with a lot of nastiness in it, which is quite good for mathematicians to tackle.
And certainly from our perspective, we have loads of people working on this sort of model in our business going forward, looking at all sorts of, it goes back to the various scenarios, looking at what might happen if various bits of the plant fall over on various parts of the system, what might happen over time if new generation weren't to come on, if demand were to grow in certain areas. So we're constantly looking at, well, given predicted demand growth, what would we expect the market to do? And of course, through things like the 7 and the 10-year statements in both gas and electricity, we're trying to gather all the market intelligence together to actually give the best view to the market going forward in terms of this is what the market sees as the likely scenarios, and then you as a potential investor might say, well, given those scenarios going forward, I may or may not take an investment decision to actually get some value out of that potential future. But an enormous role for mathematics.
I was thinking more of, and more of the sort of trading, the day-to-day trading markets, which I guess you have in the industry. And it was the, I mean, Janusz effectively said there is interesting mathematics.
Oh, very much so. I mean, there was a similar workshop we organized in Edinburgh a couple of years ago, Maths for Energy, and there were people from trading floors from energy companies, and they all had PhDs in maths and physics and operational research. And they said, without PhD, you just cannot enter into that because it's so heavily mathematical. Whether it works or not, well, you can look at financial markets, obviously, and that's another story.
So actually, this is a good opportunity for me to be able to explain my point of view, because I mean, I see 3 time scales, and one where I feel really comfortable with markets, and that's the sort of medium time scale, maybe a day, a week ahead, maybe months. Longer than that, the politics make me, it's an area I don't think I could even bear to do research in. And the 5-minute sort of day ahead, I mean, a real-time market is something I've done a lot of research on.
Yeah.
And they're very, very different, ways of thinking. And so in my tutorial yesterday, I pointed out that I can give you a competitive equilibrium model, all the assumptions that Milton Friedman would make. The only exception is a ramp constraint in generation. And my competitive equilibrium price will have a mean, which is the marginal cost. But its variance will be the cost of blackout. And so the firefighter analogy isn't correct, because it's actually the supplier who would never go into this business. I mean, I'm sitting around in a peaking unit in the days with all this wind, and I'm just hoping to come in and make a fortune. I can sell for $100,000 a megawatt hour for an hour or 2 hours, but then the wind starts blowing again. I have to sit, and I don't know how long I'll sit. And so it's that variance issue. I mean, on average, I might make a decent profit, but if the variance is that big, nobody's going to go into the market. So you have to create. I mean, and I think that the fact that we see these wild prices in real-time markets all over the world shows that, that there's...
That
really
describes
is
it
an
also
issue.
as a kind of extreme event
Yeah.
issue as well, if you're having to wait so long actually to make your money.
Yeah, yes, and it's not that extreme. If you look at the Amsterdam Power Exchange, the prices are $50 and they go up to $300 and then $50 again. And so, but in Australia it goes up to $10,000 and that's the real-time market. So day ahead is not that volatile. So it's a very different analysis.
I think this plays to sort of one of my closing remarks about the way in which the electricity market will, I think, flip to the demand side becoming more and more important, because traditionally you might be sat there as somebody who's invested in a peaking plant, and you will run it obviously from time to time, and you'll get rewarded, and it'll cover your annual running costs and give you a profit. As we move into this world of more distributed generation, potentially electric vehicles recharging the grid at night, providing balancing storage, large-scale battery storage, then actually the economics of a piece of peaking plant might change completely, because actually you've been taken out of the market by the demand side. So I do see it being a very much more complex, but actually even more interesting picture going forward. And we've started now to see the publication of feed-in tariffs and people getting paid for selling their energy back to the grid. But again, we have to understand, what's the certainty of that future, what's the stability of policy, and actually, how much will the need to decarbonise drive technology? So, for example, we don't currently have very large-scale battery storage that's useful to us in any way, shape, or form on the grid, but maybe this will drive it forward. And we don't really have anybody at all really plugging in very low penetration of electric vehicles going forward. But as they do go forward, and we anticipate scenarios in which there's a significant factor on the grid, then that also drives need for investment. I was just sharing at lunchtime sort of the in-joke in National Grid about the Tesla, which is an electric sports car in the US. And the in-joke is you can always tell the early adopters because the substation at the end of the road is on fire. Now, that's not literal, thankfully, but it is an indication that as you drive one technology, you may need to invest in your grids in order to supply against that technology.
I think there is the scope for a bit of confusion here, though. Go back to what I said. I mean, when we designed the market in the UK, our real-time mechanism, very consciously, and the economists amongst us, is called the balancing mechanism. It's not called the balancing market, and that is not. There is a reason for that, which it isn't a market. So it's not two-sided, and National Grid is firmly in control, and it invites bids. But National Grid has the keys to the system. Now, based on existing metering technology and those people we had who could offer close to real-time services, we still balance over a half-hour period. That's the period you're held to account over. Now, there is a very interesting question about, with the march of technology, and if we get this advanced metering, about whether you can move closer to real-time markets. Now, the second thing is, we had this debate, as I said, 10, 11 years ago, still carry the scars because we went to the Competition Commission. They said, no, we put a huge amount of evidence in. And the debate got characterised as, and I think it's quite eloquent, the good spike, bad spike problem. So, the fact is there are good spikes. And when the system is genuinely tight, and when actually we don't have enough, physical capacity and demand elasticity isn't sufficient, you may need prices like that. And actually they proved very effective in the winter of 2005-06. Not at punishing granny at home, but just getting some of the large users to say, we can switch to oil or we can move to alternatives. So we saw the gas spot price go from trading at 30 pence to £1.50, £1.80. And as I said, you never noticed it in your domestic bills. It just did enough to get some of the demand. That's a good spike. A bad spike is when the Enron trader goes and sticks a spanner in a generating set. So if I just knock it off the system, I can, and I can do that for a sustained period. And I think one of the difficulties in both market design and regulatory architecture is, how can you actually distinguish between those two? And we try to go to the authorities and say, we need the ability to, where we think it's a bad spike, basically constrain the behaviour. At the time we were told no. Actually, interestingly, 10 years on, one of the lessons the Labour government did is said that they were persuaded of that argument, and that actually we did need to have limited powers, so that we needed the ability to constrain that behaviour, where it clearly is untoward. We were having this debate while California was going on, and it seems surreal to us. I mean, that we were saying this, and we were saying, no, you're wrong, and then many of the quotes you gave about, came out later. I mean, I actually would say that the US has been better at reacting to it than we have in Britain, where
In Illinois, 6 months.
nobody's ever been fined in the UK for that sort of behaviour, and $400 million fines. So, as I said, we don't have a real-time market. We may do in the future, if the metering technology gets there. And
Can I make a follow-up?
Yeah, well,
Sorry. I just want to make sure we don't confuse goals with mechanisms. So responsive demand is an incredible resource. It's better than wind. It can be ramped up very quickly. Think of it as a generator. It can be ramped up very quickly, ramped down, and it could be made very predictable. And one way to create that flexibility would be real-time prices, but there could be other mechanisms.
Well, of course, it's important to say is that markets are our servants, they're not our masters. They provide price signals which we choose either to accept, or we say, gosh, these real-time price signals are too volatile, we must insure against them and have a plan, have a degree of planning in the system. So it is back to the optimal mix of planning in the market. Any other questions?
Can I just ask Chris, we heard about the Irish network this morning, and what the speaker was saying was sometimes the short-term optimum damage the long-term optimum. If you put sited generation in one place, that might seem the short-term the cheapest thing to do, but in the long term, that was not the sensible thing to do, because when you want to add more generation, that would block the sites for more generation. Is this a problem in the UK at all? Is it something you don't have to worry about?
I don't know that I can honestly answer your question without giving it a bit more thought. I think it links back to the question the gentleman asked over there about, are we trying to plan in such a way that you build a network that's most efficient but also least cost for consumers down the track. Certainly in terms of the way that we build the network at the moment, we respond to two things. One is we respond to the market signals that are coming from generators who are coming and asking us for connections to the system. And they're making their decisions as to where they're going to be locating their generating plant, but they'll often be doing it in response to the charging regime. And then the other thing we're responding to, of course, is the issue I mentioned around anticipatory investment and getting on and actually building infrastructure so that actually we can cope with a lot of the rush when it comes, hopefully in the not too distant future, to actually get generation onto the bars. It isn't something, certainly in my last 7 years in the transmission business, I've heard mentioned as a particular problem for us in the UK. Steve, I don't know if you've come across it.
I mean, all I'd say is, how you price your transmission network, particularly in a small island where building new lines is very difficult, is vital to making the best use of what you've got. And we clearly do not do that at the moment. So, the economics dictate that if there's a renewable and a coal-fired generator in the same location, there's limited transmission capacity. When the wind's blowing, the wind generator should run because it has lower carbon. That's not what happens. I'm afraid it comes back to the comment about behaviours, which is, if you're a generator and there's a transmission constraint, you are in a position of being a local monopolist in that, if you have the right to generate on that transmission, you can name your price, and there's very little you can do because the speed at which you can build a new transmission line and take that away. Now, we have had an unimaginably long debate, and I'm sorry to be like a broken record, it's gone on for 10 years, saying that transmission access arrangements need to change. And again, you just get, obviously there are big companies out there with positions and there's money on the table, and, we failed to make the case and to get those changes through. The last Labour administration then took some powers up, and it came to a decision that we didn't think was sensible, which is they said we're just going to allow anyone to connect to the network, and whatever those constraint costs are, we'll just dump them on customers. Now, to give you an idea about what's happened to constraint costs, they were about 20 million when we first raised this in about 1999. I think last year they were 350 million, and I think, we can have arguments about whether they rise to 500, 600 million. So, again, this is just this area about all this stuff gets brushed under the carpet and hidden. Now, we try and make this clear to people, but I think there is a huge benefit that could be driven by having sensible reform of the way we price and access what we've got to make sure that, wind generators, if they're there, run first, and that we use the higher carbon to fill in, and we just don't do that at the moment. But again, it comes back to political economy and lobbying and those sorts of things.
And I'm sure there are a number of generators in the room who would have existing plant on the bars and existing rights. And of course, we've got this interim connect and manage issue that Steve mentioned, and the transmission access reform work goes on. But if you've made an investment, and I'm not speaking as a generator because we're not allowed to be a generator in the UK, which is fine. If you made an investment with an assumption you would get certain access to market, then if suddenly your capacity rights were taken away, you wouldn't be very happy. But at the moment, of course, you can be in a situation where actually you can't run for whatever reason, and therefore you get paid anyway because you're getting constrained off payments, and ultimately constrained off payments get paid for by all of us as consumers. So moving to a world in which, if we are serious about decarbonising, you actually say there's almost some sort of, and this isn't the National Grid position, it's just me talking from personal perspective, some sort of merit order which says if you're giving a real value to decarbonising energy, then why wouldn't you always want to have renewable sources of energy running first? And instead of actually having to invest in a second transmission line, you just let the wind farm on if the wind's blowing, and when it's not, the conventional generator gets access to the system. But if I was a conventional generator and invested in the plant, I'd probably take a very different view.
But essentially, my question actually, are you still letting those situations arise, not just ones you've already got? Are we in fact building up more things like that by letting people site in one place, and then a year later finding actually want a wind generator there and you've just allowed a new person on.
Well, one comment, because there's a question about transmission planning. I mean, transmission planning in onshore in this country is really futile issue for discussion, because the last line was built 10 years ago, as you mentioned, with the huge delays. Basically, because of the public attitude to new transmission investment, and again, people were saying this morning, that they hate pylons, they want renewable energy, but they don't want transmission lines. So it is not really an issue, but issue is real issue is for offshore. At the moment, we have offshore wind farms, and the generators, the investors go for a least cost solution. I mean, just straight connection to the nearest grid point. But if you look 10, 20 years ahead, what we might have is people are talking about supergrid on the North Sea connecting from Britain to Norway. So it means the multitude of connections going different directions. There are still technological problems to do so. I don't want to go into the two details, but then there's a real problem that those least cost solutions which go to connect the existing wind farms which are being built might not be the optimal solutions from the point of view of looking at the grid 10, 20 years ahead. And no one knows how to solve that problem because no one knows how the grid will look like. So that's why I think that the current thinking is just to let people build the way they want without having a plan for the future. But I think it's a real problem.
I mean, I think the fundamental is, I mean, we do charge differentially for transmission at different locations, or grid do, to try and reflect the cost. So you do signal to generators. You know, if you want to locate in Scotland, it's very expensive because we have to build new lines all the way down to where the power's consumed. That is hugely controversial. You know, you have the Scottish First Minister who's run a very effective campaign, and, you know, sure, he discussed it with David Cameron when he met him, saying that transmission charges in Britain should be postalised, that you should pay the same irrespective of where you are, and that not to do this is...
Well, he would say that,
well, no, but at the end of the day, he's an elected politician, and he speaks, you know, albeit in a minority government for Scotland. So this is the problem, that again there isn't a sensible debate about this. And as I said, you know, if you go and search on Google about Ofgem and transmission charging, you will just find a whole bunch of press reports and everything else saying about how this approach that National Grid does is crazy. Well, candidly, it isn't. It makes sense. You know, if something, you know, you wouldn't say that we should equalise the cost of housing, and that, you know, we should say to people you can buy a house at the same price in London as you can in, you know. But this is where the politics gets very difficult.
But the hope would be that Scotland could attract a lot of dirty energy because it would have such cheap power, and so you'd have, you know, I just don't know. I guess there's not enough industry in the UK to do that. If you did have a big aluminum manufacturing industry, and that would help a lot.
And just to follow up on that, we do have a lot of heavy industry. We're the 6th or 7th biggest manufacturer in the world, so don't believe the hype about the death of British manufacturing. The trouble is that where the main source of power was 30 years ago is very different to where it'll be in 10 years. And then no one's really sure where it'll be in 40 years. And if you're building a lot of heavy industry, that actually has a longer lifetime than perhaps your energy policy has. But I'd like to ask the panel, as we discussed earlier, about how you influence policymakers. And I think a large element of that is keep it simple, stupid. And successful lobbyists pick 2 or 3 very simple messages and then make sure they hear those messages every day. I'd like to invite the panel members, if they could each pick one different policy that we can bang on every day to get us somewhere better, what would each panel member's policy be?
Shall I start? I mean, I think the number one thing is we need a uniform high price of carbon throughout the economy. That's it. If you're serious about climate change, that is the number one thing.
I will go after Ali G and say, keep it real, man. and that's the message. Basically, politicians are, well, there's a lot of magic thinking. They say, well, okay, if we have this target, 20%, 30%, whatever, somehow it will happen without thinking through the consequences to the cost, to the customers, and basically whether physically it is possible to do it. So that's why I just keep it real. Is it possible to do it? Just talking about something does not mean that it will happen.
And I think from our perspective, you know, could pick on lots and lots of things, but what do we worry about more than anything else? Yes, absolutely, price for carbon. Planning, sort out planning. It's critically important because we can't achieve anything whether it's a generator building something or ourselves building something, or basically getting clean renewable energy to consumers unless we get planning issues resolved. We thought we were pretty well there with the IPC, and now we're not quite so sure. And what I should say on that point is, I don't mind who makes the decision, Secretary of State or whoever, just make it in a timely fashion.
Well, I could say we've created magic with big infrastructure projects in the past. The internet created huge industries. It was fantastic in the US, and now Google gets to make billions. And the power grid was something that was stuck in, and now people can make money out of this beautiful resource. And there'll be a beautiful resource stuck in the UK in the next 5 years. And right now is the time to create that magic. And somebody's going to have to create that infrastructure. Is that simple enough?
Yeah.
I think, unfortunately, I mean, Michael and Chris have stolen two of the best. I mean, I take a slightly different tack to Michael because I do think it's very difficult for the UK unilaterally, particularly given the fiscal difficulties we have, to go for a high economy-wide carbon price, irrespective of what anyone else does. So I just narrow that down and focus it and say we have all this plant to replace. It probably makes sense on an option value basis to try and get that replaced with relatively low carbon generation, not to seek to replace the whole fleet immediately. And so I think you could do a more measured intervention, and we've talked about this in our response to the last energy white paper, where you go for some sort of low carbon tender where you say we will pay whatever we need to pay to just get 5 or 6 gigawatts built, and you bid into us, and it's technology blind, and just do that and say that's enough for now until, and gets us on a pathway until such time as, the US, Australia, India, China, and as I said, I think that would be affordable and be simple and manageable.
On that issue of optionality, do you think it would be really helpful to say, let's keep the LCPD plants alive as backup generation for another 5 years so we can delay investments in what may be carbon intensive durable equipment?
I think the way you'd need to do, I think you could do that. I think it would be sensible. I think there is a way you could try and persuade the Commission to do it, which is that legislation was driven, as I said, not by carbon, but by SOx and NOx. It was clear at the time there was a view about the economic damage that does to make sure you don't punish the people who did invest to be LCPD compliant and to reward the people who wouldn't. You could keep it on the bus bars, but imply a SOx and NOx tax, which means that they effectively pay for that. I think that would be eminently sensible. And again, we've made representations to government to say, you really need to think about that. The worrying thing is there's been talk, we had in the difficult winter, we allowed some of the generators to bust their SOx and NOx and we didn't charge them for it. So we punished, we punished the people who've done the right thing, actually physically invested in their plant to be compliant, and we rewarded the people who haven't. So I think there's a way of solving that problem. It's a simple tax that says, yes, if we really need you, you can generate, but we're going to charge you for the stuff you throw out as a result.
Just to mention, it feeds into a lot of what you said, really, that Louis Gerstner, who managed IBM, his way of dealing with complexity and a cacophony of messages. It was a relatively simple receipt, not to reward people for predicting rain, but only rewarding for building arcs. It comes into some of the same that you were saying, that those who actually do the right thing or make something happen, they should then set the agenda for whoever sits back, rather than the other way around.
Just wondered how confident the panel members were about whether the UK has the skills needed to invent the future that we've been talking about, or whether we'll need to import those as well as the energy.
Well, let me kick off, because this is something that I really personally feel very passionate about, and that's why I took the opportunity to sort of share a few quotes with you. We've got a fantastic skills base within the UK, and we've got great academic institutions, but we do have this situation where engineering is not valued in the same way as it is perhaps elsewhere in the world. You know, there are countries around the world where if you hold out your business card and it's got the word engineer on it, you know, you are quite revered. Here in the UK, we have this situation where engineering isn't understood, and actually, I think we've dumbed down the word. I mean, if, with every respect to them, you know, road sweepers we call sanitation engineers, and our beloved housewives, my wife happens to be one, you know, domestic engineers. This is a real issue for us. It's a scary issue because actually, as we transition to this low carbon economy, and we think about the demographics of the existing workforce, then actually we need thousands and thousands and thousands of engineers going forward. So I don't think there's any problem at all in terms of the teaching, of the capability. It's a sheer volume issue, and actually attracting enough people into the industry and getting them to understand that it is a really exciting place to work. Talking to a colleague at break, he was saying, you know, I like the comment you made about you know, engineering being low paid and the fact that that wasn't the case in National Grid. How much do you pay your engineers? Now, I don't know if he was sort of looking to benchmark his own business or looking as to whether he should apply or not. But the reality is that we've got a real problem, and it's a real societal problem in terms of the way that we value this. I don't think the fundamental foundations are flawed in any way, shape or form, because we've turned out great people in the past, and I'm sure we can turn out great people in the future. For me, it's a supply and demand thing. The more we value engineering, science and maths going forward, and the more society reflects on them, then the more people will be drawn into that to help us solve the problems that are coming our way. I mean, there are just magnificent engineering achievements all around us, but actually, unfortunately, a lot of our youngsters today don't recognise them as such. So I think it's a real problem for the UK, not in terms of the fundamentals, but actually attracting people in.
Well, as an academic, well, I have to say a few comments about it, because of course it's education is quite important issue. I think there's certainly a skill gap, but basically it's a self-inflicted wound. Because what happened in the 90s after privatization, basically the industry wouldn't take almost any new engineers, because it was the downsizing with the industry as the whole lost something like 2/3 of the workforce over 10 years. So what was the effect on the education? That, for example, in Durham, which I worked then, we had to close power option because basically there was no work for people, so they stopped applying. And that was the case with a number of universities in this country. What's happened now, industry is crying loud, you know, we need more people, we need more people. But education does not work in a kind of stop-go fashion. And also, educating people takes some time, and also getting them up to the appropriate skill level again takes some time. So it's at least 10 years time lag between taking a decision to get the final product, so to speak. So basically what I'm saying is that you cannot operate in a kind of oscillating world and then complaining that actually we need people, why don't we supply those people? I think that it's very difficult to replace that lost generation of the 90s. Of course, now there are huge opportunities, and I'm familiar with a number of MSc courses, and people are transferring into energy from all other skills. I mean, almost every university in this country has an MSc course, and the applications are really going through the roof. People are really excited about it, coming from all different directions, because they see how exciting the field is because of the global climate change and etc. and etc. But it will take, I think, at least 10 years before those people will get to the appropriate skill levels. But then there's maybe a question, there may be a bubble. There's something like with comms. I mean, the same situation was 10 years ago with comms, which were flourishing, and now basically there's no employment for those people. So basically, what I'm saying is this education is a very delicate issue. It needs continuity. You cannot stop one day and then get it started up again.
If I can just reflect on that, I think you know, the allegation that Yanis has put towards the energy industry about stopping recruiting people is entirely right. You know, the energy industry went through a period of responding to its price controls, seeking to be more efficient, and actually was not recruiting in the way that it was in the past. Thankfully, over the last few years, we've been growing the business again, and in fact, certainly for my last 7 years in the transmission part of National Grid, the numbers of people in our business has gone up every year as we've tried to respond to these challenges going forward. So I'm not sort of pointing the finger at the education sector, But I do have this broader worry, not just for the energy industry, but for engineering per se, that the perception of engineering in society is not in this country what it should be and what it is elsewhere in the world. And if we can collectively do something about that, I think that will be part of the solution.
Sean, any?
Well, I can say I'm not an expert, and I'm also very
What about
biased.
America?
But I can say I'm in my favorite research and educational institution in the world. And Frank Kelly and Richard Gibbons, for example, created a revolution in internet congestion control through beautiful science and beautiful papers. And so, the intellectual power just here is phenomenal. It is a shame we don't do more outreach, that these revolutions aren't known to the public. I mean, it's something that we should work on, is trying to explain how our success story is better.
Steve, do you want to say what Ofgem are doing to support the skills gap?
Well, I mean, the last two sets of price controls we've done have reflected the fact that, we've been through a cycle. We did inherit industries that were overmanned. It was right for 10 to 15 years, and it was a huge benefit to the UK economy and consumers to see some level of demanning. We have reached a turning point, and the last two sets of price controls we've done, we've given the companies thumping allowances, to retrain and reskill, because that ageing workforce is moving on. I think the only thing we have to do, the only note of caution I'd say, which not to cut across anything Chris has said, is the politicians again need to be careful not to overpromise. Britain has lots of things that it's brilliant at, and lots of intrinsic, skills that we can bring to bear on this. But saying that, for example, we're going to be manufacturing all this stuff, well, maybe, but I doubt it. But that doesn't mean there isn't huge opportunities to create high-value jobs in this area. We should just be honest about where they're likely to be. And, we should also celebrate the fact that for all the times we criticise, what we do in energy policy, Britain's been genuinely, a world leader in that for 20 years, and we've all benefited from that in terms of the gas prices we've paid, the electricity prices. The creative collective genius, and it was engineers, lawyers, economists and others who managed to solve some of these problems, can be redeployed again to say, in a world where we had gas-fired power plants, nuclear and coal, we found some really innovative ways of finding more efficient ways of doing that. I'm sure can be redeployed to say in the new world with these new problems we can do it again. And to end on a lighter note, just to reassure Chris, and he probably thinks this is a good thing, I'm still young enough that I can remember going to my career teacher and my head of sixth form and telling him I was going to be an economist, and just being laughed out of his room and told that I'd end up being a teacher, and that there was no demand for economists to do anything. And that wasn't that long ago, but so maybe the world would be a better place if career teachers were still saying engineers.
I think on that note, I think we'll end it there and invite everybody to thank our panelists.